For anybody whose only knowledge of how sexuality is variously represented in Japanese popular culture and media is based on reports in the English language press, the general impression is probably one of a sexually very open or even unrestrained society. Certainly that's the impression that's given in many of the rather hyperbolic reports that you can see by Western journalists who've written endless articles about the supposed sexual depravity of Japanese popular culture, particularly focusing on manga, anime, and computer games. A great example of this, and it goes back to the 80s, but I love to use it because it's so crazy, appeared in the Atlantic Monthly by journalist James Fallows, who's actually, a fairly well-known journalist. And I love the title of his article. It's called "The Japanese Are Different from You and Me." So you know you're in trouble with a title like that, in which he argues that Japan's underlying social motif is one of low-grade pedophilia. And it's not unusual to find these kinds of statements in the English language press, even in fairly mainstream media outlets. Now, Fallows' main evidence for this claim is the apparent youthfulness of many manga and anime characters. As we all know, there are multiple genres popular with both men and women where young-looking characters feature in sexual and violent scenarios that would be problematic in many Western countries, where child abuse materials legislation has been broadened to capture purely fictional images as well as actual child pornography. And this has been fairly well reported in the news. Here's an example from CNN. A lot of American travelers going over the border into Canada are being caught with stuff on their iPads and other electronic devices. If you look at the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is an organization run out of New York, they have a whole page of advice on what to do if you're a manga fan and you're going to Canada. It's basically don't take any stuff with you. But Canada's not exceptional here. Australia has very strict regulations about the representation of child characters in manga and animation, as indeed does the UK. I'll be talking about that a little bit more later. Now, in English language reports, Japan is frequently presented as failing to comply with supposed international standards restricting fantasy sex and violence where representations of young people are involved. Spokespersons for international agencies such as UNICEF have been lobbying Japanese policymakers for the past decade, demanding increased restrictions not only on what kind of content is judged suitable for minors to look at, but also on the way in which minors themselves are depicted in manga, animation, computer games, and other media. It's been argued that not only is the level of sexuality and violence depicted in some manga and animation unsuitable for their target audience of teens, but also the characters who are or appear to be teens themselves are depicted in violent and sexual scenarios, which, if they were depictions of real, actually existing young people, would be unlawful. Although the majority of examples of harmful depictions cited in these reports pertain to the fascination for rori, or lolita, figures in media directed at boys and men, there has been increased scrutiny not only of young people's reading material, but of the depictions of young people in that material, which has placed the spotlight on a sexualized genre popular with girls, that of boys' love, manga, and associated media. I imagine it's a fairly manga literate audience here, so I won't go into too much about what boys' love is, other than to point out it's a genre which has its roots in mainstream manga publishing in Japan going back to the early 1970s and now is a global phenomenon. As you can see, here's a screen capture from material which is available, translated into English. However, despite the fact that in an international context, the depictions of male-male sex and romance played out in BL text between figures who may appear to be minors has placed this material firmly in the context of global debates over child pornography, the frame of the debate over the inappropriateness of BL is different in Japan. It's not a child porn argument which is being launched there, and it's really what I'm going to be talking about today. So in this paper, I argue that the proposed harmful nature of BL, and BL is a genre which is basically produced by and for girls and women. There is some interest among men and gay men, but it's predominantly a female genre. So the anxieties about the harmful nature of BL in Japan need to be understood in the context of a wide-ranging debate over gender-free policies in education that's been going on since the early 1990s in Japan. So as I'll point out later, conservative politicians, lobby groups, media commentators have been arguing that Japan's economic woes, and in particular the rapidly declining birth rate, stem from confusion over gender roles created by liberal social and educational policies that are seen as attacking traditional sex and gender roles, and BL has become caught up in this process. So in this paper I draw attention to the criticism that's been levied at BL texts that specifically emphasises not so much the seeming youthfulness of their characters, but their depiction of inappropriate and incorrect sex and gender roles that are likely to cause misidentification and confusion among their youthful leaders. Linking these anxieties to the manner in which BL texts flaunt the conventional sex and gender roles outlined in sex education directives from the Ministry of Education, I argue that female BL fans' self-depiction as fujoshi, that is, rotten girls, has a heightened significance when considered in the official context of the purity narratives that are channeled via Education Ministry directives into the classroom. So I guess most people here are familiar with the term fujoshi. It's widespread throughout the fandom, even in English, and I think you know it's really made it into the mainstream when it's being taught in eikaiwa. Although I think ane wa fujoshi desu. I don't think My Sister's a Girl into Male Homoeroticism quite captures what the Japanese is saying here, but it's basically an attempt to come up with an English translation for this term. Fujoshi is a Japanese term meaning girls and women. There's a homophone for that, different characters but same pronunciation. Fujoshi, you change the fu to the fu of tofu, the fermented rotten curd, yeah? Hence, instead of girls and women, rotten girls. So, BL narratives, with their rejection of conventional masculine roles, of heterosexuality, but most importantly of the procreative function of sex, are in direct opposition not only to sex education narratives rolled out in schools, but also to the increasingly strident government calls for Japanese women to produce more children to address the falling birth rate. Okay. So before I say anything more about the BL debate, I'll just give a very brief outline of manga regulation in Japan. As Sharon Kinsella's pointed out, in the post-war period there have been recurrent bouts of institutional interference in the moral, educational and political content of manga. There's never been an anything goes policy in Japan regarding depictions of fantasy sex or violence, as is sometimes suggested in these alarmist English language reports that I mentioned. Japanese manga, like all other publications, are governed by Article 175 of the Penal Code, which prohibits indecency. Indeed, in 2004, the artist Beauty Hair and his publisher Shobunkan were both successfully prosecuted under the article for extreme depictions of sexual violence in this manga, Mishitsu, or Honey Room. And Kirsten Cava is going to be presenting on this prosecution case on Saturday, and it features as one of the chapters in her truly excellent book, The Art of Censorship in Post-War Japan, which came out a few years ago from University of Hawaii. So I won't say much more about this. You can hear directly from Kirsten. As well as national legislation prohibiting obscenity, various municipalities in Japan have the power to pass local ordinances. That's in Japanese, Todofuken Jōrei. And these have been used to restrict distribution of material deemed harmful to youth. Since manga are a ubiquitous source of entertainment in Japan, sold in convenience stores, train stations, newsstands, as well as bookstores, children have always had ready access to them. But as Kinsella points out, in order to avoid legal action and fines, retail outlets have tended to refuse to stock manga categorized as indecent. This has had a washback effect on manga producers who have practiced self-censorship so as not to run the risk of losing access to major retail outlets. Where Japanese and Western codes of indecency do differ is in the degree of fantasy sex and violence considered permissible. As you know, you probably know, if you watch Disney, you watch anime, they're quite different in what you can actually depict. Censors in Japan have tended to apply rather specific technical definitions of obscenity, focusing on such items as visibility of genitalia, pubic hair, sexual penetration, whereas figurative, stylized, symbolic representations of sex have been overlooked. Indeed, for the cases in the Mishitsu case, it was the fact that the artist had depicted the scenes as realistically and lewdly as possible that rendered this particular manga obscene. Whereas the more stylized depictions that you tend to see in BL materials have not tended to attract the same attention from the police. Now, calls for restriction on sex and violence depicted in manga directed at young people, often led by PTAs, have gathered pace in Japan, really, since about the late 60s, 1968, when Japan's most popular boys' manga, Shonen Jump, began to serialize the story Harenchi Gakuen, Shameless School. Yes, this pretty famous manga. Wildly successful series as a manga was later turned into several movies and a TV show. And it makes explicit reference to the repressed sexuality of a co-ed school environment. In fact, this is one of the things that, we'll talk more in question time, but this is one of the things that really outrages the Australian censors, is that Japanese popular culture shows schools as highly sexualized environments, which is unthinkable in an American or Australian context, because, of course, high schoolers have no hormones. They don't need sex education. They're just there to study. But this is one of the big differences that Japanese popular culture loves to explore the sexual potentiality of, student-teacher things, and that really upsets authorities in Western contexts. But the most sustained call for reform of manga content followed on from, as I'm sure you'll remember, the tragic murder of 4 infant girls between 1988 and 1989, that the serial killer, Miyazaki Tsutomu incident. Around that time, journalistic investigation into his background and lifestyle revealed, he was an isolated youth, he was an avid collector of Lolita manga, he liked to watch pornography. Hence, in press reports, popular psychologists were drawing a connection between his private fantasy life, the stuff he looked at, and his actual actions, generalizing beyond Miyazaki to an entire generation of alienated young men who couldn't make this distinction, apparently, between fantasy world of video and manga to reality. So following on from the Miyazaki incident, a coalition of PTA committees, feminist groups, women's organisations were lobbying local and national politicians for increased surveillance and regulation of violent and sexualised imagery in manga and anime, particularly those marketed to young people. They also lobbied publishers themselves, sending complaint letters about manga they considered particularly harmful, and placing these warnings about neighbourhoods. And sometimes, I've seen the warnings, I've never seen them, but they used to have deposit bins where you could put your harmful books to be disposed of safely. So here we see a sign in a local neighbourhood, don't look at them, don't buy them, don't read them, these books are harmful. And they're basically talking about manga here. So one result of this increased vigilance was a spike in the 1990s in the number of manga which were designated harmful to youth. So they weren't banned exactly, but zoning laws were used to get them out of regular bookstores, only able to be sold in designated areas. So by the mid-90s, the political regulation movement had largely been internalized by manga industry, which resulted in a kind of wave of anticipatory self-censorship exercised directly by manga editors and individual manga artists. But of course, this kind of self-censorship code and this complex history of manga regulation in Japan is never referenced in these alarmist articles that Western writers write about sex in popular culture. One issue with this, however, is that the self-censorship code only applies to official publications which are released by Japan's major companies, and it doesn't cover the extensive self-published genre of original and parody manga known as doujinshi, or amateur magazines. And we say amateur, but actually they often are extremely professionally produced, printed, and are available for sale at places like comic markets and in designated bookstores. So there's really a very permeable boundary between producers and consumers of manga in Japan. People consume, they also produce their own stuff. And it tends to be in the amateur work, which is not as regulated as the official work, which goes through the hands of editors and publishing companies, that you can find the most sexualized content. And of course, with the internet, this is all over the place. So, as I'll discuss later, anxieties about the potentially harmful effects of sexualized depictions in manga and other media popular with young people have only grown in this convergent media environment brought about by the internet, which has made access to these materials even easier. And as I mentioned, most of this fuss from the 60s to the 90s was about boys' comics. But in the 2000s, girls' comics, shoujo manga, come to be scrutinized more, and the particular genre of BL. And that's what I'm going to be talking about now. I'm going to talk to you about the Sakai Library incident. So, really, since the beginning of the 2000s, BL, which is a very substantial subgenre of girls' manga in Japan, began to attract more mainstream attention and criticism. And one particular incident occurred in 2008 when an undisclosed number of people began a campaign to have BL books removed from public displays in libraries in Sakai, which is a kind of municipality in Osaka. The target of the campaign was not BL manga as such, but a genre of what are known as raito novel. So they're kind of fiction, but they have manga, and also they have racy illustrations, as you see here. A huge number of BL titles, and 100 of them contained extreme depictions of two men naked together. But, you know, all of them are going to have some depictions. It's just like some of them were considered to be particularly edgy. Now, this campaign to have this material removed consisted of a series of phone calls and emails sent to libraries and the local council inquiring why public funds were being used for the procurement of this pornographic genre, and asking libraries to account for the actual number of BL titles in their collections. And as a result, in August 2008, the library committee made a decision to remove all these light novels from the shelves and place them in storage facility, only to lend them out on request to mature age readers. And they said, okay, we won't buy any more BL. And this prompted, in November of the same year, 28 female city councillors and a further 12 people involved with the manga industry from around Japan, including prominent feminist academic Ueno Chizuko, and request that they reconsider this decision to sequester light novels and to restore this collection to the general circulation. Then there was a further complaint of women councillors, some gender-related citizens groups, who were arguing that the library had really exceeded its authority when it simply decided to restrict a particular genre of reading matter based on a small number of complaints. It was even argued that the sequestering of BL material could even be seen as a form of sexual discrimination against young women, because it was only really young women who actually requested this. So you might get some oji-san who are kind of saying, oh, this is disgusting, yeah? But you know, it's not intended for oji-san, it's intended for young women, so you need to service that need. Now, what's interesting about this is that most of this fighting was going on over the internet. But the mainstream press picked up on this dispute, and it was widely reported in Japan's national dailies. Odd reports about it. On the whole, the media discourse agreed that this was a very troubling genre, largely to do with the youth and the gender of its audience. but also very interested in the sheer volume of BL titles in the library. It became obvious that there were about 5,500 boys' love titles, which had cost in the region of $37,000. So that's a substantial amount of boy-on-boy action available for borrowing by girls in just, I think Sakai City had 3 libraries, so shared between them. That's kind of a lot. And other media reports made much of the fact that these highly sexualized stories featuring male-male romance were requested by girls known as fujoshi, thus drawing attention to the self-consciously subversive nature of the work's relationship, of these BL works' readership. And it wasn't just newspapers which got involved, but, kind of wide show, current affairs shows. So here's an example of a fujoshi. I don't know quite why her eyes are blacked out like that. It kind of makes it seem that she's talking about something really serious, but they haven't made much effort to disguise her identity. But as she says here, this is her quoting, Rori-san is saying, "There isn't a single girl who hates homos." Okay? That is actually a quotation from, I forget the name of the title, but it's a canonical quotation from a mainstream BL series. And it's widely circulated among the fujoshi community. And there were a number of exposés of these crazy fujoshi who spend all their time imagining boy-on-boy action. So this issue also generated a lot of debate on Japan's social networking sites, including Mixi. And in particular, it got picked up by extreme right-wingers who were very unhappy with women's, with confusion about women's role in society. Let's put it that way. And they began to criticize, this so-called feminazi critique on the internet predates the BL fiasco, and is, as I'll say in a little bit, tied up with anxieties over gender affirmative policies which were being rolled out in the 1990s. But these extremely reactionary, right-wing, masculinist, anti-feminist groups who were criticizing women who were getting out of control, this whole BL fiasco, the BL fiasco was a further example for them of how Japanese society was going to the dogs, really. So there was a lot of heated debate in these right-wing websites around the dangers of BL. Now, the main points reiterated by the opponents to boys' love is that it's pornographic, and as such should be treated like male-oriented pornography and basically kept away from young people because of its bad effects. Because they defined it as pornographic, it was inappropriate to use taxpayers' funded money in libraries to acquire this stuff. And something I like, which also I think suggests this is the nature, that this is the gender of the people complaining, the fact that the genre deals in male-male sexual relations, and there is so much of it, it's hard to avoid, meant that if you were a guy and you're browsing for something to read and you open this, seeing it is a form of sexual harassment towards heterosexual men. Right? But certainly in the feminazi camp, most of the debate was around the fact that BL was becoming so popular among young women that it was a sign that gender-free policies implemented by local councils throughout the 1990s to root out institutionalized sexism had gone so far that young women were now confused about appropriate gender roles, causing them to identify with male homosexuals and potentially even render them transsexuals. Right, so it's a fairly hysterical debate, but it's constantly being pulled back to, here's another crazy example of women out of control, which has been facilitated by these socialist liberal councils who support women's rights. Now, this last point about gender confusion seems to have been a major concern for BL's detractors, since, as Atsuka Keiko points out, she did an analysis of all the titles that were sequestered by the library. It was only titles dealing with male homosexuality targeted at women that were removed. Novels and manga directed at gay men were left in the circulation, as indeed was the Japanese version of Harlequin romance, heterosexual stuff. That wasn't touched, that was left there. It was only the BL light novels which were taken out of circulation and put away. Now, when it comes to the response by feminists and by BL readers to this, rather than engage with the is it pornography, isn't it pornography debate, they were much more level-headed. They were basically arguing that libraries have a responsibility to respond to reader demand. It's not the library's responsibility to sit in a committee and decide what literature they think people should read. They should use the money they've been given by public taxes to provide the literature that the public wants to read. Yeah? So it's not for a particular group of library employees to decide whether this is or isn't appropriate. They simply respond to public demand. They also pointed out that the very high demand for BL suggested there was strong interest in the genre, whereas the small number of complaints suggested that the library was giving an inappropriate amount of emphasis to the genre's detractors. So the pro-BL lobby were basically trying to limit the debate to matters of procedure and policy. They weren't interested in getting into this argument about what BL's about or whether it is pornographic or not. So after a consideration of arguments by both sides, eventually the Sakai Municipal Library did return these BL titles to general circulation. But the initial knee-jerk reaction to warehousing the material after a few complaints is a good indication of the kind of sensitivity which is surrounding BL in Japan these days. Indeed, very soon after this resolution in Osaka, another city council, this time Kuwana, which is part of the Nagoya metropolitan area, went through a similar kind of public scrutiny investigation of their BL acquisitions policy, which was discussed in various feminist and media discussion sites on the internet. Was suggesting that BL had now become a battlefront of proponents and detractors of so-called gender-free policies. And the fallout continued. In 2009, for example, Ueno Chizuko wrote a rather good analysis of this particular incident, and she tied it in with general rise of feminist bashing, which was taking place in the mainstream media, led by hysterical, right-wing people, and also in along internet sites. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that BL is situated at the heart of these anxieties around the gender-free controversy. So I'll just say a little bit about where that comes from. As you know, the bubble burst in late 80s Japan, and by the 1990s, it was apparent that there were quite a lot of problems facing Japan in terms of the economy and the population. Birth rate was declining, the economy was in the midst of a long recession. There was a growing sense at this time that gender equality or more affirmative policies which would help women get out of the home and into the workplace would be good for business, because women's increased participation in the workforce would provide greater financial stability for families, but also increase the amount of money available for consumption and help boost the economy. And in the early 90s, the possibility of actually getting some gender reform through the Japanese Diet was facilitated due to the splintering of support for the conservative Liberal Democratic Party that had a kind of stranglehold on politics in Japan for most of the post-war period. And there was also the rise of high-profile female opposition leaders who ensured that reform of gender-specific legislation was in the spotlight. So due to these factors, there was quite a lot of feminist involvement in policy making during the 1990s, and this culminated in the passing of the Basic Law for a Gender Equal Society in 1999, which had all sorts of provisions which were then rolled out by local authorities aimed at giving women increased agency, particularly around career choices. And what's interesting about this debate, though, is that, as Osawa Mari has pointed out, increased involvement in policy making by feminist groups helped shift the manner in which gender issues were debated at this time. Until the mid-1990s, it had been customary to argue in Japan that gender is pretty much understood as the same thing as sex. Hence, it's kind of natural. So, because there are sexual differences between men and women, social roles based on those sexual differences are not in themselves discriminatory. That had been a kind of common way of framing male-female difference in Japan. And until the mid-90s, the most prevalent Japanese term for what in English we would call gender equality was really danjo byodo, which means man-woman equality. You're saying, well, they're different but equal. The idea of gender as a set of culturally framed distinctions between men and women only really gained popularity in the 1990s, and the loan word gender doesn't actually appear in the Kojien dictionary till 1991. And as Osawa observes, it's not until 1996 that the term gender actually appears in an official document in Japanese, so that's kind of late. So from this point onwards, the mid-90s, the idea of natural role divisions between men and women begins to be challenged by this new discourse of gender as a social construction. And this fueled demands for, in Japanese, gender-free or gender-free society, which began to be used quite widely in the early 2000s. Now, research by Ayako Kano noticed that the use of the term gender-free was originally intended to signify freedom from gender discrimination. But its use in the media came about at the same time as a similar phrase, barrier-free, which was relating to improved access to facilities for people with disabilities. The circulation of the two things at the time, some people got the idea that gender-free was about eliminating gender from society and denying any kind of difference between men and women, as if gender itself was a discriminatory category. And this isn't how it was intended to be used, but by playing on the anxiety stirred up by this misinterpretation, conservative groups in Japan were able to orchestrate a backlash against the supposedly radical and fringe feminist-supported policies. And this feminist bashing intensified at the political level with the election of the conservative Ishihara Shintaro as governor of Tokyo in 1999. Okay. So it's in this context of general anxiety about gender-free educational social inclusion policies that the whole BL debate gets pulled into the debate. Okay. So I've got one final example which I'll run through. Won't be more than 10 minutes. Okay, so Ishihara Shintaro, I'm sure I don't need to introduce him to you, comes to power in Tokyo in 1999. Very outspoken. Well, he's a total oji-san, right? He's very outspoken, not very friendly towards gender-free policies, and is extremely concerned about youth, lobbying around protection of children or protecting youth from bad influences is a very strong conservative agenda. Now, concerns about young people's exposure to sexually explicit materials and regulations aimed at protecting them are often a topic of discussion at the Tokyo Youth Affairs Conference, which is convened regularly by the Tokyo governor, which is from the 1999 onwards is Ishihara. And they review policies relating to youth who are resident within the Tokyo metropolitan area. In December 2008, the conference was convened for the 28th time, and the theme of the conference was to address the wholesome development of youth in an era where mass media are increasing their spread within society. And the conference made a number of recommendations concerning revision of the regulations for the protection of young people, in particular that restrictions be placed on the sale and distribution of manga, anime and games, which depicted non-existent youth in antisocial sexual situations. So the non-existent youth basically means imaginary characters. The Japanese is hijitsuzaisei shonen, right? Non-existent youth. And everyone was like, just like, what? What? You know? And I'll say something in the questions, if you like, about this particular choice of terminology. But anyway, in February 2010, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Office for Youth Affairs and Public Safety proposed a series of amendments to the Tokyo Metropolitan Ordinance regarding the healthy development of youth that were based on recommendations made in the conference. And if adopted, these recommendations would have increased the power of bureaucrats to make decisions concerning representations that were deemed harmful to young people, particularly around this category of non-existent youth, so depictions of young people. Provisions included things like including filtering devices on mobile phones, measures aimed at restricting the availability of imaginary visual representations of sexualized youth. Pornography, strong violence. This content was already prohibited from sale to minors with the seinen, the adult-only kind of sticker. What was particular about this was its increased scrutiny of the age of the characters depicted, these supposedly non-existent youth, these imaginary youths who are running around in manga and anime doing things which, if they were real youth doing it in real life, would be illegal. So the legislation targeted non-existent youth who could be recognised as looking like or sounding like they were under the age of 18, which is like basically every anime character, particularly the sounding like, who were recklessly depicted in antisocial sexual scenarios. So you can see that it's odd phraseology here. The rationale behind the revisions was that such representations may highly impede the development of the healthy capacity for judgment regarding sexuality and thereby impede the healthy development of youth. Now, officially known as Bill 156, the ordinance was also referred to as the Non-Existent Youth Bill, especially by its opponents, because it was such a hysterical term. As the bill proceeded through various readings in the Assembly, there was some opposition. In May, the Tokyo Bar Association issued a statement that the bill was an intrusion by government into issues that were better handled by parents. The Japan Federation of Bar Associations also spoke out against the revisions, arguing that the bill should be replaced with one which placed emphasis on protecting the rights of real children rather than scrutinising the activities of imaginary ones. In May, 1,500 manga artists and 10 publishers protested the bill, maintaining that the wording was so vague it was going to be an imposition on freedom of speech. New media and Twitter, YouTube, Mixi also got involved in opposing the bill, arguing that basically there's so much stuff in Japanese popular culture which would contravene this, that absolutely everybody would have something somewhere on a shelf, and that regular people, ipan no hito, would be turned into sex criminals. So there's a lot of humour around that. If you look at these debate sites, here's a regular guy with one of his lolly figures, and he's saying, "No, it's a cross-dressing old man. No breasts. Look." So a lot of humour directed against the bill, arguing that basically there was just so much stuff out there that people overnight would become sex criminals for hanging on to it. And these concerns had some traction with the opposition parties. The first presentation of the bill was defeated, but later that year, in 2010, it was reintroduced with some revisions. The revised bill attempted to avoid the criticism of vagueness by being more explicit as to which media were to be targeted. In the revised bill, the scope of the legislation was reduced. Manga, anime, and computer games were specifically singled out for scrutiny, whereas real-life photography and literature were exempted. And it's not ironic that Ishihara himself is a novelist whose early novels were, at the time, criticised for being harmful to youth. The vaguely phrased text concerning non-existent youth was rephrased. The new bill targeted any character, irrespective of age, engaged in sexual or pseudo-sexual acts that would be illegal in real life, or sexual or pseudo-sexual acts between close relatives whose marriage would be illegal, if presented in a manner that glorified or exaggerated the acts in question. So they're trying to narrow the focus, but they're really pissing off the manga and anime producers even more. So, of course, these revisions did little to quiet the concerns of opponents of the bill. If anything, the manga and anime industry, as well as its fans, felt that they were being unfairly targeted. And the removal of the controversial and much ridiculed term non-existent youth failed to staunch criticism that the revised bill actually expands the target to offending characters of any age. And it's interesting that there was a widespread cultural critique of this, including Takamiya Keiko, extremely famous manga artist who's now the president of Kyoto Seika University. She weighed into the media debate, and she pointed out that the wording in the bill was such that even her manga, Song of Wind and Trees, which she started serializing in 1976, which deals with homoerotic themes, sexual abuse, could fall under these regulations. And she wrote an article pointing out that it was kind of ironic that this manga had been very popular with today's mothers and was in danger of being banned because, or rather zoned out of Tokyo, zoned out of bookshops because it was considered to be dangerous for their children. So she was a powerful voice of opposition around this. Fujimoto Yukari, who you might know, feminist critic, Meiji Gakuin lecturer, she also got involved. I like this. She christened the new bill the non-existent sex crimes bill because it was targeting stuff that would hadn't actually happened. It was just imaginary. And she drew attention to the potentially deleterious effects that the bill could have on women's manga culture, given that BL frequently engages with themes of rape, of incest, of sexual abuse. And she noted that women, who are often the victims of sexual abuse and discrimination, often use BL as a genre to work through these issues in their own private lives. And as you can see here, this is a Fujoshi in tears. That now the bill has gone through, everybody's freedom of expression is dying. But despite this criticism, the bill got through. All right. So to come to my conclusion. So as we've seen in this discussion, the context surrounding the controversies generated by BL and other sexually explicit media is rather different from that in many Western societies, where depictions of characters who may appear to be underage in sexual scenarios are caught up in child pornography legislation. And I'll talk about this more on Saturday, but this is the kind of stuff that as a Japan literate person you're up against when you're dealing with government agencies and international agencies. ECPAT is End Child Prostitution and Trafficking, an NGO which has done great work in developing countries about protecting children. I mean, I'm not criticising ECPAT here. I'm just pointing out their wonky logic when it comes to the prosecution of manga and anime. So again, we have this hyperbolic description that child pornography is available in bookshops and convenience stores, which it really isn't. I mean, the more hardcore stuff is zoned out and has been for a long time. I particularly like the second section of read. Sections of civil society, including producers and consumers of child pornography, some academics, that would be me, and lawyers, seem to be desensitized and accepting. I love the way that I get lumped in with producers and consumers of child pornography here. And again, I love at the end, little research has been conducted in Japan to demonstrate such interrelationships. Is this fictional stuff really impacting on the abuse of children? But studies undertaken in other regions of the world have clearly exposed it. There's no reference to that. And of course, if you were to investigate in Japan, you'd find it has one of the lowest reported rates of child sexual abuse in the world. So you'd think, given you can buy child porn in the convenience store, you think that this would actually flow through into mass, abuse of children on the streets, but that doesn't happen. So this is the kind of thing that whenever I'm trying to speak to an official audience in my project, and I'm trying to say, look, the situation in Japan is rather more complex than this. This is the kind of official speak that comes back to me. It's very difficult to resist. So the production and consumption of this material in the West is even more serious and morally fraught than it is in Japan, which still does not have any restrictions on the simple possession of child pornography materials. The production and dissemination of this stuff is illegal, but simple possession is not. It should be recalled that the Non-Existent Youth Bill was never about banning this material altogether, but simply restricting its ability to minors in the Tokyo area. However, as opponents of the bill pointed out, the legislation is certain to have an impact on artists and publishers who could lose access to one of their most valuable markets. The attacks that conservative politicians and lobby groups have launched on sexually explicit media and on BL specifically, I think, need to be understood in Japan in the context of the gender-free debate that's been raging over the last 2 decades. Conservative policymakers such as Ishihara seem to believe that Japan's current economic woes and declining birth rate are directly linked to the erosion of traditional values, in particular clear gender roles for men and women. So it's easy to see how BL, which deliberately plays with and subverts male authority and the kind of wholesome relations between the sexes which are inculcated in sex education system, can be seen as dangerous to youth. So the Tokyo Metropolitan Authority's use of zoning laws to restrict young people's access to sexually explicit manga is, I think, in this age of convergent media, actually unlikely to be very successful, given that the large amount of doujins is published and circulated on the internet. The fact that you can't get it in a shop doesn't really mean anything. And I think it's interesting that BL fans themselves have embraced this rotten signifier. Also indicates that there's quite a lot of resistance among young people and young women themselves, to which agents of the Japanese state continue to promote fixed, normalised gender roles through education and other policies. Despite the increased controversy that BL narratives have become embroiled in over the last decade, what I find encouraging in the Japanese context is the scale of opposition to government attempts to legislate on what constitutes healthy development of youth. As we saw in the Sakai Library incident, a broad coalition of female legislators and academics, as well as readers, opposed the removal of BL items from this facility, and they were successful in having it restored to circulation. Although the Non-Existent Youth Bill passed, it did galvanise a wide-based opposition and enable extensive public debate about the nature of childhood, the freedom of expression, and the role of the state in promulgating fixed and normative gender roles. However, as recent moves by the Liberal Democratic Party to further extend the reach of child pornography to include fictitious images shows, BL is likely to remain a controversial and contested form of girls' culture in Japan. In addition, Tokyo's winning bid to host the 2020 Summer Olympics is likely to give conservative legislators the impetus to clean up aspects of Japanese popular culture that may be disapproved of by overseas visitors like James Fallows, if he's still around. So the existence of BL subcultures outside Japan is actually more perilous. In contrast to the public furore that greeted the Non-Existent Youth Bill in Japan, the recent redrafting of child abuse publications in countries such as Australia, the UK and Canada to include purely fictional characters has largely been overlooked by the media. And no concerted opposition from academics, liberal legislators or indeed readers and fans has emerged to challenge this legislative creep. BL and Japanese manga and anime in general are likely to remain key objects of surveillance in Western societies as this supposition that they pose a danger to youth goes unchallenged by Western media, academia, and indeed the fandom alike. So I'll leave it at that point. Thank you.